What does it mean to study the Bible critically? I mean, isn't it wrong to criticize God's Word? And how would we go about doing that anyway? In her book, Opening Israel's Scriptures, Ellen Davis identifies 5 features of what she calls conscientious practice of critical interpretation. Before I summarize them, I want to talk about this phrase, critical interpretation. Critical interpretation does not imply a negative attitude towards the Bible, and it doesn't mean we're trying to show that the Bible is somehow deficient. Rather, critical interpretation of the Bible is really just about carefully paying attention to the details. So, once we've agreed that critical interpretation isn't a bad thing, let's see what Ellen Davis is calling us to implement in the way we approach the Bible. Number 1, we should clarify our presuppositions and agendas when we approach the Bible. We all come to the Bible with what some scholars call our pre-understanding. That is to say, we all bring our own thoughts and agendas to the Bible. Now, this fact is inescapable, but we would do well to identify our presuppositions before we begin investigating the text. For example, here are a few aspects of my life that influence my approach to the Bible. I grew up in a Western culture which contrasts with the Eastern culture behind the Bible. I live in the USA, a global superpower. Israel and the Jewish people were anything but superpowers in the ancient world. These 2 aspects of my personal experience shape the way I see the world. In some ways, they help me read the Bible, but in other ways, they actually hurt my ability to understand it. If we want to study the Bible well, we had better examine ourselves first. Here's the second feature of what Ellen Davis calls conscientious critical interpretation. We must identify all the literary features of the text. I am convinced that studying the Bible requires us to move slowly. Davis encourages us to examine every literary feature in the text we're studying. This approach represents one way to respect the Bible. Throughout the centuries, Jews and Christians alike have believed and insisted that every detail in the Bible matters. The third feature of critical interpretation is that we must examine the relevant social and historical factors associated with the text. The biblical world differs drastically from our own. Most Western Christians live in free, democratic societies. The social world of the Bible knew nothing of the U.S. Constitution. They lived under the thumb of foreign empires. In addition to the social features, we should examine the historical background of the Bible and the biblical world. We need to know about famous figures and events, daily lives of ordinary people, ancient customs and practices, and the composition and development of the Bible. The more we can reconstruct and understand the historical background of the Bible, the better we'll be able to understand the confusing aspects of it. But even if we do all of that work, we will need to implement the 4th feature of conscientious critical interpretation. And that is, we need to justify our interpretation of the Bible. The Bible is not easy to interpret. If it were, then there wouldn't be so many denominations. So we need to explain why we think the Bible means what we think it means. How do we explain the literary features of the passage? Why is our historical reconstruction plausible? And how did we arrive at our interpretation anyway? If someone won't or can't explain why they read the Bible the way they do, we should wonder if there's an ulterior motive taking place. Before we get too confident in ourselves, though, we need to implement the 5th feature of critical interpretation of the Bible. We must keep an open mind toward revising our interpretations. Again, the Bible is not easy to interpret. Just as critical interpretation of the Bible requires us to justify our interpretations, it should also encourage us to keep an open mind, because we're likely to find better ways of reading it in the future. So those are the 5 features of what Ellen Davis calls conscientious critical interpretation of the Bible. I'd love to know which one stands out to you. And as always, if you're still hanging around this point in the video, I'd love for you to subscribe and hit the notification bell.